Tonight we have Er-Gene Kahng with us, and she's going to be talking a little bit about her own experiences and also a little bit about the work of Florence Price. As she's speaking, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. And also, Alyssa and I may use your question to ask Er-Gene. So also we might ask you to repeat your question. Thank you.
Oh, is it my turn? Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Happy International Women's Day today. I am here to speak about Florence Price and answer any of your questions you might have about Florence Price, but also about, I think, the process with which to sort of revive, restore, reconstruct a composer who is not usually presented in the history books. Being a classical musician, so much of our knowledge and tradition and ways of knowing is basically inherited without question, at least speaking to my own experience. And so Florence Price was really instrumental in questioning for me as an interpretive artist what it means to create new knowledge. So I was able to see some of the questions that you posed. So Danielle and Alyssa, I thought that maybe a good way to, progress with the discussion is to maybe have people pose their questions. Should I just refer to the Google Doc on my own here?
Oh, I can. Here. I think a really great way to kick this off is Jack asked a question. Jack, are you here?
Hi, yes, I am.
Yeah, I really like your question. Do you want to read it for us?
Yeah, of course. Let's see here. Okay, so first off, thank you so much for taking the time today to come and speak with us. As we all know, Florence Price is not super well known, at least in the US, as a composer, which is unfortunate, considering all the great work that she did. How did you discover her work and decide to champion her work? And additionally, what was your experience like learning some of her work, such as like the Violin Concerto No. 2, given that there weren't a lot of recordings at the time while you were working on it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jack. I think this is a really great introductory question, I think, also to just talk about perhaps my own experience with Florence Price. So I have been teaching at the University of Arkansas for about 14 years now. I grew up in Los Angeles, and so a lot of my own personal experiences being here and working here has been to define home. I also was not born in this country, just to include a little bit of personal bio. And so, and I traveled around quite a bit. And so I think dealing with also more largely the aspects of hyphenated identities around being Asian American were, without even my own knowledge, perhaps, on the conscious forefront of things, always in my mind, which is, where is home? What does home feel like? What do my friends, allies, what do they look like? And what does it mean to be a friend and an ally to others? And what does it mean to put down roots in a place? And so all of that just to say, the genesis of my project with Florence Price actually came from a very personal place, which is I personally never felt at home in Arkansas for quite a bit of time, but I also didn't know what would be needed for me to feel at home. And so my personal question was, well, let me just first start by learning a little bit of Arkansan history. Developing a relationship with the place and learning your history, I think, is one of the first places to start, at least for me, to question places of connection as a person living in modern day. And so I have many friends, obviously, working at a university who are doing historical scholarship, who are dealing with primary research, and who also work in the special collections. And so I was participating in a symposium that usually on campus is in the month of February, just Black Music Symposium, just an umbrella term for Black music. And one of the organizers for that particular year decided, I want to do a personal tribute to Florence Price because that's just my personal interest. And so all of that to say, my introduction was accidental, but also highly personal, in that I was already having a compass towards learning more about regional history, Arkansan history, but I was also asked to contract string quartet members to perform part of Florence Price's string quartet literature as part of the new acquisition that the Special Collections had acquired in 2010 upon finding all these manuscripts in St. Anne, Illinois, which you may have read about. The first collection was mostly in the 70s, donated by Florence Price's late daughter. But then in 2010, a lot of the historical accounts of the music that the historians had written about, but whose manuscripts could not be found, were found in this collection. And so it's an incredible discovery, obviously, for performers who are now able to actually access this music and not just read about it in the history books. I think there was another question that you may have asked. I'm not sure, Jack. Did I answer all the questions? Oh, what do I like most about Violin Concerto No. 2?
Yeah, and additionally, since there weren't a lot of recordings of it at the time, how did you navigate that, and how would you recommend for us as musicians to approach learning a piece where maybe there aren't a lot of great models for us to follow or listen to in relation to studying that work?
Yes, absolutely. So I will be the first to admit that this was incredibly daunting for me. As I said in the very, very beginning, I considered myself very much a traditional classical violinist. And the way in which violin is still taught, mostly, we're still, as a department, talking about how we can continue to evolve in our curricula. But at least from 10 years ago, our main objectives was to basically teach the classical music canon as defined by the Paris Conservatoire from the 1890s or so, and to perform it well. And by well, we just mean, make as little mistakes as possible, technically perfect, and musically and interpretively approved by the gatekeepers of classical music. So you want to, basically play Tchaikovsky concerto the way that perhaps your teachers taught you, with a little bit of maybe tasteful interpretation. But again, in the traditional sense, that tastefulness tends to be quite narrow, especially as an interpretive artist. And so obviously, the way in which we were taught was to study the score, consult all and available recordings, do background research on the composer and the time, to show up to your first lesson informed, and to study the score. And obviously, when maybe half, if not more than half of those resources do not exist or are unknown, what constitutes background research or responsible research coming to a manuscript, getting ready for a performance, no less a recording, very much is different. So all of that just to say, I think what constitutes being a responsible performer doesn't change, in that we have to remember that we are interpretive artists and that it's our responsibility to, as best as possible, learn what the composer intended and what is available to us via the manuscript. However, when the composer is no longer living and when so much of that has not been recorded, there does need to be some guesswork. And I think as a performer, as a researcher, that's the scariest part, because you always ask yourself, am I being ethical? Am I being responsible? Especially when you're driving in the dark. Do you just simply say, I don't know the answer? And so the most ethical thing is to just say, I don't know, and not proceed forward. To be honest with you, I suffered from extreme imposter syndrome, in that when I was recording this or thinking of recording it, I sort of thought, I don't think that I am an appropriate advocate or ambassador for this music. I'm not Arkansan, although I don't even know really what is deserving of the qualification of that membership. But let's just say I did not consider myself Arkansan. I considered myself an outsider coming in to learn more about Arkansas history. I'm clearly not a Black woman. And so what does it mean that I am trying to champion this music, which some people may consider appropriation? And what is that line between appropriation and appreciation? What does it mean to be an ally and not to be African American, for example? So I think there was a lot of leaps of faith for sure. And I would not have been able to, I think, go beyond some of these questions without community support. And so I think that's the other thing that I was able to find that I did not anticipate, which is there are so many people working on Florence Price, we just don't know it. And I think once there are people who proclaim their project, their interests, their passions, especially in the day and age now, this way with Zoom and email and internet, you can find people all across the globe that are working on Florence Price and or issues of DEI in classical music. And sometimes all it takes is for someone to put out their work and say, this is what I'm working on. What do you guys think? And so I also tell people that my recording by no means is a final statement. And I think that was also a big hurdle for me to get beyond because, again, thinking in my own traditional framework and training, the recording pretty much tends to be the last culminating statement for many artists, meaning they will perform Brahms concerto 100, 200 times throughout their lifetime, and only upon really working through their own interpretation and voice do they then feel committed and able to publish their own stamp on things through a CD. And of course, you can make multiple CDs throughout your lifetime, but each recording is a statement. And while I stand behind my recording, I can also say that 3 years later, there are many things that I think I would probably do differently. And it's something that I'm able to do in live performances now. But the recording in itself, of course, is kind of a frozen snapshot in time. I was able to speak to a lot of historians about Florence Price's life. Special Collections, of course, holds all of the correspondences and manuscripts of her music. And so there are still many discrepancies. Florence Price not having had an editor or a team of people who could have promoted her, she did not have the luxury or the privilege that many composers now have who have a larger platform to workshop pieces. And so there are discrepancies between the piano score, the orchestral score, and in some cases, some of the parts, which of course she had to manually write. And so there needed to be some guesswork, which that's part of what I would love to go back and re-explore if possible. As you know, a lot of her music features what we would call bitonalities or cross relationships and chords, which yield crunchy harmonies that maybe by traditional metrics would be considered incorrect or too crunchy. And so, for example, both of her concertos are in D major, but I almost wonder if the key signature is just symbolic, because already by the second chord you're in D minor. And so, a lot of historians have talked about this healthy exploration of boundaries and this pushing of traditional understandings of tonality. And also the second violin concerto is very succinct. I think she was also trying to experiment with form while writing in the grand, heroic violin concerto style. And so I do think that some of these innovations that we see in her music are foiled in traditional classical forms, which I think is part of her genius, personally. I think that we sometimes tend to have ideas of innovation that are completely disruptive or paradigm shifting, or even in some cases a complete antithesis as to what came before, where they destroy the framework which they inherited. And I think those are really fascinating and revolutionary and amazing. But I also think that it doesn't mean that those who tend to want to go a more integrated or holistic or conservative, I suppose, approach, where there is kind of this hybridization or hyphenization of forms, is any less genius, honestly. I think actually that integration is more difficult because you have to learn where the spaces are for innovation within a given framework. I don't know if this is a good time to insert this, but I wanted to share some manuscripts of PDFs of manuscripts of Florence Price's works. If anything, I just wanted to give you a sense of her handwriting. So let me see what I can share here. So I've got the Violin Concerto No. 1, her Negro folk songs in counterpoint, and also a very hazy manuscript of her G major string quartet. So in no particular order, let me just draw up the score for Violin Concerto 1. Can everybody see my screen? So this is one of the copies, and as you can see right here, it says scratch copy. Many of her manuscripts actually have many scratch copies. So it was not clear, for example, speaking of challenges for recreation, which scratch copy was the most original. And they're not dated, and if they are dated, they're all dated in the same year. So it's difficult to determine. What I love so much are just, just her extremely neat handwriting. I love the whiteout and the red pencil. You really get to see, I think, the thought processes, and also I would say even the personality of a composer through their handwriting. It's handwriting analysis via musical notation. The first concerto is so interesting if you haven't had a chance to listen to it because of its resemblance to the Tchaikovsky concerto. And there is historical accounts and contemporary accounts that talk about how Florence Price did actually use this as a template. And so, again, speaking of the narrative, is that something that therefore becomes kind of a criticism, towards Florence Price's originality? Or is it simply just a concerto that honestly, she was working through ideas? I think there's enough deviation here that it really, to me, is Florence Price. But at the same time, there are definitely homage to Tchaikovsky's concerto. So Jack, again, going back to your question of what was it like to recreate and perform these pieces, I would say, for example, Violin Concerto 1, for better or for worse, I definitely used my own interpretive template for Tchaikovsky 1 in recreating her Violin Concerto 1. And that's something, honestly, that I would love to go back and explore. I think there's enough deviations with the second and third movement that I was able to release some of my own mental sort of frameworks of Tchaikovsky concerto. But for the first movement, for sure, I think, it has a heroic first theme, kind of a very lyrical second theme. It has an extensive cadenza, which very much, for me, brought on the muscle memory of having to perform Tchaikovsky. And certainly the virtuosity, I think, the violinist as hero was definitely an identity that I found myself taking on. Let me go ahead and also share something smaller scale. Let's see. Here are the Negro folk songs in counterpoint, which to my knowledge, I think Apollo String Quartet is in the middle of recording, but it's not as well known, I think, as the 5 folk songs in counterpoint. So here it's really brilliant. She, as you might gather from the title, takes folk songs that most people would already be familiar with, but then coats it in language that is very much, I would say, 20th century, where there's sort of modernist counterpoint and really features, I think, again, what we talked about, this integration of vernacular and high art. The counterpoint, of course, has always traditionally been a litmus for composers to display their compositional virtuosity and intellect, and I think we really do see that here with just how she integrates these familiar folk songs, but then has a lot of fugal relationships between the 4 voices. And what we really get to see here is just, I think, her nimbleness in composition, whereas the concerto is definitely a larger canvas. You can see all of these crossed out markings which I just love. I was speaking to Chris, Danielle, and Alyssa before, just saying that as a traditional classical violinist, I do not usually have the luxury of seeing manuscript handwritten. And of course, now nobody really writes in handwritten form. And if they do, it immediately goes to Finale or Sibelius. And so we don't really get to see that personality, that manual personality. And by the way, if anybody's interested, these manuscripts, as far as I know, are available in the sense that Special Collections here at the University of Arkansas is happy to provide copies for them, especially because now people are unable to travel on site. And for some time, the library was even closed. So even if you were here, you weren't really able to visit the collection in person. But we have several visitors from all over who always come just so that they can see these manuscripts in person. And it's always a really special experience for them, as it was for me as well.
I think since you've been talking about Florence Price's unique style and how you can really learn a lot about her personality through her writing, I think Dylan's question about your view of contemporary American classical music would be very interesting. Dylan, do you think you could read your question for us?
Yeah, sure. So it's actually sort of like two questions in one. First off, I just want to say I really enjoyed your performance of Price's second violin concerto. I thought it was really nice to listen to. So I guess just going off of that, in playing some of Florence Price's music, have you noticed anything that's sort of like been unique to her style as a composer? And I guess like the second part of the question is how has studying her work and performing her work, how has that like shaped your view of contemporary American classical music?
Thank you so much, Dylan. Those are huge questions. So I will try to answer them at least from a microscopic standpoint, and maybe we can funnel outwards. I think going to the first question about style, I continue to discover things that are magical and innovative and original. As I was speaking before when I was showing the manuscripts, I think whenever we approach something new, even if it's somewhat new, completely new, the different ranges of newness, part of the plus and the minus of being part of any kind of tradition is that we build shortcuts to it, in the sense that, as I was speaking before, looking at Florence Price's Violin Concerto No. 1, my shortcut was Tchaikovsky. And so on the one hand, having the muscle memory and just sort of saying, okay, I've got this. Some of these cadenzas that are virtuosic, I've studied them before. So in some cases, they were real shortcuts. But as you might anticipate, my next point, these shortcuts are dangerous because it's a simplification and it reduces what is new to only what is known in our own frameworks. And so this in itself, I think, funnels into a larger issue about assumptions and about ways of knowing and the channels to which we can honor other ways of knowing. And that being even in our own craft-based performance aspect. DEI work is not simply something that I think exists out in the world, but not in the practice room. And that has been something that I've been trying to explore for myself, because for too long I've imagined that somehow the practice room was its own vacuum, in the sense that all the problems that were happening in the world would somehow be shut out when I'm just practicing my scales. And it might seem like a stretch to some people, but I need to believe that my work in the practice room matters, because otherwise I'm not really sure why I'm playing music. And that was primarily my own challenge early on in life, which is, how do I engage with the modern world and to examine current values and to also contribute to solving modern day problems, but also playing music as a string player that's 300 years old and no longer, the problems maybe we inherited, but going back to Freiburg, Germany, in the 1600s. What is the point of connection other than building a connection to history, which of course that's also important too. So all of that just to say, I think I've gained an appreciation for her harmonies, her efforts to explore the large ranges of what I was speaking before, her smaller scale, more intimate works, which pay homage to her Southern tradition, to her Christianity, to her Black woman, Southern Jim Crow law lived experience, her own struggles, I think, to be recognized, to adopt a system that would knowingly limit her own success, but also to adopt it. I think it's a very complicated relationship to be trained in the Western European white tradition and to somehow feel the need to showcase her ability to have subsumed and absorbed that tradition, but also to find ways to rebel against it. Or at least, I don't even know if it was really a rebellion, but I think to represent and find ways to represent herself. I really believe it was a form of self-advocacy. And so I think some of these choices that we've talked about before with the bitonality, with uses of folk vernacular material, with experimentations with form, with casting a form, but then to kind of immediately change our expectations, for example, about design, about ways of listening. The Second Violin Concerto constantly cycles through these familiar themes, which would, in traditional understandings, be considered non-developmental. And I think, again, with having so much of a premium on developing motivic ideas, if we adopt that framework, her language and her choices could be seen as inferior. And so I think, again, questioning the framework with which guides our judgment about the value of these works, I think is really important, and something that by performing Florence Price, I get to experience every day as a performer. And there's a huge responsibility, even as a performer, to be kind of that contributing voice. And I think programming also is an extremely powerful decision. It's so easy, I think, as a performer, especially, again, as an interpretive artist, especially also as a student, where maybe in some situations you're just playing pieces that are assigned by your teachers, to not feel enough agency. But I really want to encourage everybody to realize your own power in shaping this continuing narrative of classical music and to define what it means to do the work of DEI in classical music. And then Dylan, I'm sorry, I forgot the second question, or second part of the question. Oh, redefining contemporary American classical music. So I think this is a way actually to then build that bridge to history. So much of my understanding of being a classical musician was living in the past. Of course, I was building a connection to history, but I also, to be honest with you, before Florence Price, felt like the greatest achievement I could ever fulfill as an artist would be to perform Brahms' concerto to the best of my ability, which again is very narrow, meaning with a great sound, great rhythm, great intonation, deference to style. I mean, really, I could count the sort of grocery list on my hands. But at the same time, as you know, fulfilling those small parameters is extremely difficult. And so I think getting out of the minutia of what great musicianship or even being a great violinist looks like was really a dream for me, because I don't necessarily know if I enjoyed necessarily being that microscopically steeped, but I knew that our craft required it. But I also felt that this conflict between how do I live in the modern world but also pay deference to history? How do we understand history? And many of the things that we need to respect, but also say, this is not how we want to necessarily live in the modern day. So making Florence Price a historical figure, but also a contemporary figure, I think in that way, I don't want to say solves, that question for me, but it certainly makes me feel a lot more legitimate and legitimized as a classical musician living and working in modern day and not simply denying the present. And I think it broadens the parameters, basically, of what contemporary classical music means. Because I think, again, traditionally that means sort of living composers. But I think basically Florence Price is also a contemporary classical artist and composer.
Yeah, and I think this is a great place to pivot into a discussion about our orchestra because we're about to dive into Adoration. And with that, Tanvi, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, so I think you already kind of touched on it, but my question was like, how can we, as like young musicians who really have never experienced like contemporary music, like indulge or like get into it in a way that's like, I mean, because for like we've been taught like classical music, it's like there's a right way to do it. Like, how do we get started with that?
Thank you so much, Tanvi. And do you mean in terms of adoration, or do you mean in terms of just unknown composers that are not introduced? Can you specify?
Like both, but in this context, I guess adoration.
So I would, again, just encourage you guys to just dive right in. I think being a specialist's field can be paralyzing. And something like being a violinist where there is no ceiling to expertise, it's very daunting. And I think it can really lead to a kind of paralysis that I was speaking about earlier. And so I would just urge all of you guys to realize that music is a form of expression. And so in that way, I encourage everyone to find things that personally resonate with any piece that you're working on. So if it's something like Adoration, knowing that it was for organ, knowing that it was towards the end of her life, in some ways, it's a culmination of her compositional style, but it's also, I think, intentionally simple. Again, it's sort of a word that people feel such fear to use because there's, again, such a premium around complexity and virtuosity and perceived senses of intelligence and development. And so I just think really questioning one's framework and being aware of it, but at the same time finding places in your own practice room, in your own experiences with music to indulge, honestly, and to not just make it a cerebral or historical lesson has been really freeing for me. Speaking again as just a classically trained violinist, it's funny how I found it. It took me a very long time to realize that even within music, I was denying my own emotions because I was so set on the technical expertise that was required. And I think also as a performer, we're often taught, much like actors, not to get too personally attached. And so to perform successfully the work of this intense emotion and sentimentality and personal expression, there is this detachment, especially in live performance, that we are often encouraged to develop. And while I think, that's functional, I guess just as a reminder, don't forget to include yourself in this journey. So I would say, know that it's going to be progressive. Your experience performing Adoration in the next coming months is going to be very different than when you come back to it at a time of your choosing, whether it's in 6 months or in 6 years. And I think that's natural. I think the one thing that classical music has taught me is that the music is not disposable, and that what you encounter now is not the final product. And so when you encounter it again next year, there will be so much more, hopefully, performances of this, and there will be much more of a community of musicians with whom you can speak about this with and trade practical and also abstract advices about what did you do for this, or how do you conceive of this? And I think it's really through conversation and dialogue that help and deepen understanding about different perspectives, because we all have blind spots. And so I think trying to build a complete musical picture requires community. So I would just encourage you to allow yourself to enter into it, knowing that it's progressive, and to seek out community with other musicians and artists and historians. There are so many people with whom we can consult about how to construct a piece and how to perform a piece.
Having on this idea of progressiveness, our orchestra has been trying to play more pieces that include a vast variety of different composers, and especially this is really important in classical music. And I was wondering if Rico would like to ask his question about this.
Yeah, my question was related to, well, first your research in DEIA and also what DEIA looks like in classical music.
Thank you so much. The quick answer, which might seem insufficient, is that it can look like many different things because it's such a large field. And of course, lots of different acronyms are being attached now. It used to be DNI, but then it's now DEI, and now there's DEIA, and then there's DEIAB, belonging. And so all of that just to say, like many issues, I think, in life, we have to start with things that resonate with us. To be honest with you, my, quote, work in Florence Price started out, as I was saying in the beginning, from a very personal place. And I think that's where sometimes the large work begins, is right in our own backyard with very personal reasons of trying to find home, and in my situation, trying to build connection, trying to find and define community. So, as a violin professor, I feel that my biggest impact is through education. If I were, for example, a director of a performance arts center without much contact with students, maybe my biggest contribution would be programming and development and educating audiences, let's say, about how a traditional concert might look. So I think we have to start with what our medium, our chosen medium is. And so again, being on a college campus, working with young musicians, working within the parameter of violin lessons, it may seem very, very small, but it's actually a realm that I really enjoy because it's very personal. It's one-on-one. And what I might not have an immediate impact, I get to have in progressive day-to-day building. And of course, most of these students, I will see them for 4 years, unlike a class where you might only see them for a semester. And of course, you can still have an enormous impact with a lecture hall of 300, speaking for 3 months. But I think it's particularly special that we still get to, on college campuses, see someone coming in at 18 and see them grow musically. Age 22, some of them even choose to come to grad school here, and then it's even 18 to 24, such a formative series of years. So just to answer your question, I think some people have made it their life's work to build organizations and to define communities and to connect people. I think performers often use their platforms. Social media is very big, as you know. It's a channel that was not really active or existent when I was a student, but social media has been so formative in organizing people, bringing people together, raising awareness. I think a lot of book clubs have arisen also in 2020, where people were remote and felt the need to educate themselves, fill in the gaps of their own education in many cases, but also, again, have a sounding board. And so all of that just to say, I don't have a simple answer for what DEIA looks in classical music, but I do think hopefully the answer is very liberating, which is you can kind of make it what you want it to be. And within DEIA or DEIAB, people have defined it to make sense in their own parameters, and have found oftentimes resonating voices within and out of their own communities.
Yeah, so you touched briefly on this next topic, but I was wondering if Hannah would like to ask her question.
Hi, yeah. My question was, so I was wondering with like the recent increase in focus on underrepresented composers and works, like especially after the events of last summer, how your work has been affected and changed. And I know also with everything kind of moving more virtual, how that has affected that as well.
I think the biggest difference is that I feel like my community of people who are interested in this is no longer fringe. I think DEIA work in classical, well, first of all, in classical music, you're already used to being fringe anyway. Nobody really, at least I get the sense that nobody really listens to classical music in the general public, and it's a very kind of oftentimes elitist topic and sort of an inaccessible topic. It's kind of how I feel about college football, actually. I cannot participate in that conversation at all, but as you know, people who are into sports culture or even college football, here, the SEC, people are talking all the time about everything. And I'm imagining when I kind of have the trout look, when people are talking about different teams and their records, that this is kind of maybe what happens to those folks when musicians start talking about classical music. So in other words, classical music was already very fringe. And then I think within that, talking about diversity within classical music was even more fringe. And so I very much had a sense that initially when my interest in Florence Price blossomed, that it would be purely academic. And of course, being in the university, I'm very accustomed to living in the proverbial ivory tower. We professors only really speak to themselves, and then we go to conferences where there's only other professors who then talk about these things, and it never really enters the general public because it's too specialized or it's not really of, I guess, large, impactful, practical use, perceived or real. And then when it kind of made larger waves within, I guess, the DEI community, and here at least historians of regional Arkansas history, and then classical musicians, I felt, aha, at least we've got now a small community of a critical mass maybe who might be interested in this beyond the ivory tower. And I really do think that after last summer now, even if classical music as a medium is not the focal interest, I think DEI is definitely something that the country is much more interested in talking about in a more public and open way. And so I know that these discussions about equity have entered all historically exclusive art forms, design, architecture. You know, when you design a building and you can't find where the entrance or the exit is, you know, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of equity and access, literally? And so I know that all disciplines at least are talking about this. And so I feel very seen, to be honest. Even if people may not necessarily know Florence Price, I feel that there's a critical mass of people who engage regularly and are thinking very thoughtfully and deeply about DEI issues. And I feel like I'm able to better consider points of application. So when people talk about DEI issues from a policy perspective, for example, sure, it's not talking about music, but then it immediately makes me think, how could I apply that to my lessons? How could I apply that to my syllabus? How are ways that we can bring this maybe to a curricula committee and talk about this as a department? How does that inform my performances? And it certainly has changed me for sure, and in ways that I did not expect, to be honest.
And I think this would be a great segue to ask Alex a question as we're talking about equity and access, and also given that it's International Women's Day. Alex, do you think you could ask her questions for us?
Yeah, sure thing. So given your background as a musician and your experience, I just wanted to kind of hear from your viewpoint about like whether there are like a lot of issues in orchestra or just like in the classical community in general with sexism and gender discrimination, and how should we address that, and what can we do to kind of solve that?
Yes, I'm sure you are aware of the huge discussion right now about screened auditions. And that's just one example. There's also a lot of talk of just equal access to employment opportunities. And so all of that just to say, my starting point really has been, how do we create spaces where people are allowed to hold their own truths? I think this has been the big thing that has really surfaced from last summer, which is how many times have we experienced a situation where maybe you're sharing with a coworker or a fellow friend or someone something that has happened to you that is discriminatory, let's just say as a large umbrella, and the response that you receive is, "Are you sure? Are you sure that's what happened?" And sort of a dismissive or a questioning of reality or a kind of gaslighting, right? And so I think, and I'll be, the first one to admit that, it has both happened to me, but I feel I'm also guilty of it too. And while, there's nothing wrong with a healthy dose of skepticism, I think what has surfaced from, last year's events and the conversations that have surfaced from it is that there are very different realities of people living today in the same time and place. And I think some people maybe have been very slow to realize that there is more than one reality for people, and there is more than one truth that people hold, and that oftentimes people have not even been allowed to hold these truths. And so this is kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, Alex, but I think for me, the starting point really is listening to people and having conversations and withholding assumption and creating spaces for people or creating places for people and addressing my own blind spots. And really, I think sometimes teachers may be the most guilty of this, to go back and fill in the gaps of their own education. I think this is another thing that happens a lot in classical music, which is you go through decades of training, and because so much of what we inherit is kind of sort of frozen, let's just say it's sometimes running into the danger of being a museum piece. Sometimes you find outmoded knowledge or outdated knowledge, for lack of a better term, in that maybe Sibelius Concerto is being taught the same way that it was in the 1950s. You see, some of these fingerings, for example, where you can immediately detect, okay, this editor is from the 1950s because, I don't know, there's a use of a lot of harmonics, and now it's not in style to do harmonics or something. And that's a very microscopic kind of example. But all of that just to say, I think that to assume that knowledge or information or even realities are fixed, I think sometimes is often the first sign of trouble. So I don't know if this successfully answers your question, Alex, but I think, at least speaking from my own experience and my own aspirations, I think to be an ally and to be sort of a responsible and ethical performer, I think the best way that I have found right now to address these inequities is actually to do the deep work internally first. And that's just because I feel like that is the most manageable and the most pressing area for me. That's not to say that people should be doing this. It's not a prescription, but it's something that I think also being socially distanced and being isolated, it's been actually the most pertinent, is that I get to spend lots of time in introspection, in quiet introspection. And I realize that that's also a privilege for people to be able to have that, to have a quiet, safe roof, to be able to do this kind of introspective work. But also just to say that that has been maybe a summary of what I've been doing last year, is trying to look inward and to do the work inward.
Yeah, okay. On the other side of orchestral experience, I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about your experiences in grant writing and more administrative things about the orchestra.
So, of course, my administrative experience, I don't think is huge, but I did mention this to a pre-talk with Danielle and Alyssa, in the sense that I thought it might be interesting in that again, so much of my training as a violinist was simply a singular charge, which is just play the violin really well, and then everything else will kind of fall into place. And that is an example, for example, of an incompleteness and an inadequacy in my own education that I don't blame on anyone, really. I just think that is reflective of just the time in which I was trained and the values that my mentors held. But now, as my own independent person, I need to make sure that I'm filling in those gaps. And so more and more, of course, I think you see performers wearing many hats. They are a performer, they're a great, violinist, but they're also their own publicist. They also have basic knowledge of sound recording. They have a handle on social media and marketing and just how to promote themselves online. They tend to also, I think, have great elevator pitches, so to speak, about the value of their work. They're also asked oftentimes for consulting. They're also oftentimes asked to advocate verbally the importance of their work, as opposed to, just performers can just speak the most eloquently on stage through their craft. Well, yes, but also when you're off stage, can you also speak about your work and the importance of it as well and connect with, a larger sector of audiences? So all of that, just to say that I totally lost my train of thought now. Can you repeat the question? Oh, yes, with administration. Yes,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you, you guys, as I am so scatterbrained today. So all that just to say, administration was something that I was very repelled by, to be completely honest, for a long time, because it seemed very unartistic and uncreative, and just something that honestly I didn't feel interested in becoming better at. And also I didn't think I was very good at it. And maybe I wasn't good at it and I didn't like it, so it was kind of a convenient coupling. But all that just to say, we exist in systems, and the university is an organization. And oftentimes, even in higher ed, even within being in the education sector, there are times where disciplines do not see eye to eye. And for example, how can I really talk to an engineer who may have no musical experience about the importance of this work? We have to find bridges. And the thing that I've experienced personally is that actually being better at administration helps build those bridges. Sometimes more effectively than playing a concert. Sometimes more effective than just having a personal conversation. So in other words, I need to find bridges, some of which are very specific. And obviously, we have to find what those bridges are. But personally, for me, it was daunting, but also a really deep learning experience to try to advocate for asking for money for Florence Price through a grant. I think most people are very uncomfortable whenever money is involved, and asking for money to fund a project, most people would run for the hills, and I was one of them. And especially in the beginning, where Florence Price was very unknown, I would say, it felt very much like a project that ran the danger of becoming just a pet project. It's important to me, so please give me money because it's important to me, and it's not really going to help anybody else except me, and just me. And so to have to articulate the larger value of it, I think, without getting too biased about my own view, I think achieving that kind of administrative objectivity, I think, is so helpful. And I have just realized many grants are very specific, and many grants also don't necessarily provide feedback if you don't get awarded a grant. So you have to be patient, and I think just like auditions, just like job interviews, don't quit and don't lose patience, especially if this is something that is of interest to you. And I think even if it's not of interest, being able to articulate things in languages of systems and organizations and in terms of fiscal language is a basic musician skill that I think is very important.
Thank you. And I think we've covered most of the questions, but a few remaining ones are about your affiliations, such as being concertmaster of the Fort Smith Symphony. And we were wondering maybe any specific event that was very memorable to you or upcoming projects that you're really looking forward to.
With my affiliations, I think it's been great because most of my affiliations obviously are Arkansas based, and so it's been great over the last few years to see, I would say, stereotypically an underdog state experience a sense of pride, feeling that they were kind of somehow of national attention, of international attention, and so being able to be here, I think has been great. It's again, I keep coming back to this duality of inspiring and daunting, but it's been inspiring and daunting to be able to guide organizations and institutions alongside their own growing pains of how to slough off maybe inherited frameworks that may be outdated or things that they may no longer want to pursue and maintain, and to be at the table, so to speak, for that. Being concertmaster, of course, I'm not necessarily on the board, but my opinion still has been consulted and matters. And so I think being a violinist in an orchestra where, it's the largest section and so much of our identity is about the collective, it's from a performer's perspective, both familiar and unfamiliar, because as a violinist, we're also accustomed to being the soloist and playing these grand concertos, but we're also the largest section of an orchestra. So wearing, as I was saying before, with Alex's question about administration, wearing the many hats, I think has been interesting. And I think it has really guided and educated me about perhaps what the modern performer could look like. I forgot now your second part of the question. I'm sorry.
We actually have to wrap up soon, but the second part,
okay.
What
Perfect.
you're interested in the future. I think you covered that.
Oh, yes, what I'm looking forward to in the future. Well, I don't have, again, a grocery list of things like, I'm preparing for this recording or I'm preparing for this concert or things. I think the biggest thing for me is being able to find community and build community while being here now for 14 years. It's actually the longest place I've ever lived in. I moved around quite a bit. And so I think being able to experience and to learn that new beginnings are a potential, no matter how long or wherever you live, has been a really deep musical lesson for me, actually, because it teaches me to continue to look for the new in the old.
Thank you. And I think on behalf of everyone, I'd just like to thank you for coming today. And if everybody in the chat could show a round of applause, that would be great. And I especially found your segment about Florence Price's manuscripts very interesting. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much for making this space, everybody. I really appreciate it.
On behalf of the orchestra, Er-Gene, thank you so much for being with us as we get ready to dive into Florence Price's music. I want to also say thank you to Alyssa and Danielle for leading this as student moderators. We do have spots for future guests if you are interested in moderating anybody. Let's all turn our videos on. We'll take a group photo. All right, here we go. I'll take 3 as usual. All right, 1, 2, 3. So today we're very lucky to have Er-Gene as our guest. I've posted the music on the link. It's now accessible. So if you tried it earlier, it was somehow locked. But you can now download the score, the original organ version, and your various string parts. So please listen to it in several different versions. And we are kind of creating our own version. Er-Gene, thank you so much for being with us today. All right, that's all, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Take care.